Okay, and our first plenary speaker today is Lee Talbot, Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. He was Senior Environmental Advisor to the World Bank, United Nations organizations, foreign governments. He's an ecologist, a geographer. He has more than 60 years of experience in 134 countries. He was a former Director General of the IUCN. He served as a White House environmental advisor to 3 presidents, former head of environmental sciences at the Smithsonian Institution. He's published more than 300 scientific, technical, and popular publications, including 17 books and monographs. He's a recipient of several awards, including the AIBS Distinguished Service Award as an acknowledged leader in the shaping of national and international environmental policies and principles. Those of you in the US might know him for his work in helping to draft the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act during the Nixon administration. He also has won 7 races this year, including a recent Grand Prix in Pittsburgh. I have the honor of calling Lee a colleague and a friend, so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Lee Talbot.
Thank you very much, Chris. I certainly appreciate that, and it's really a very great pleasure to be here and to see all of you here. Biodiversity conservation started in the West around the time of Earth Day, right? Wrong. Many centuries before the modern nations in Europe and America were even thought of, biodiversity conservation was alive and well in the East. My intent this afternoon is to discuss these deep roots of biodiversity conservation. In other words, where have we come from? And also discuss a little bit about the unique challenges that we now face. In other words, where are we going? It's true that the terms conservation biology and biodiversity conservation are relatively recent. The term conservation biology may have appeared first in 1978 at a conference of the same name at the University of California in San Diego. The Society for Conservation Biology was founded 7 years later in 1985, and the following year at the National Academy of Sciences, there was a national forum on biodiversity. That forum and the work of one of the people here, Dr. Tom Lovejoy, marked the start of the general use of the term biodiversity. It's quite significant, it seems to me, that the terms biodiversity conservation and conservation biology and the concepts that they reflect basically ushered in the modern era of conservation policy and conservation action. But concern with loss of species and habitat, the impact of human activities on living resources, plants and animals, and the conservation, then the consequent development of conservation actions that we would now call biodiversity conservation came very early in modern human history. For example, in the 3rd century BC, Plato wrote eloquently about the loss of forests, soils, waters, and he called the hills of Attica like the skeleton of a body wasted by disease. In the same period, appreciation of the need for conservation because of the impact of human activities on plants and animals appeared further east. The Maurya dynasty of the emperors of the Indian subcontinent regarded forests and the wildlife within them as important resources to be protected. Around 300 BC, no, 300 BC, I don't remember it, but it was there. The Arthashastra of Kautilya was written. Now, this was basically a treatise on government, on the responsibilities and the methods of good government, and it specified establishing abharanya, that is, protected areas, quote, where animals can roam without fear of man, unquote. It also described the responsibilities of conservation officers, such as the protector of the elephant forests. And they specified that, quote, on the border of the forest, he should establish a forest for elephants guarded by foresters. They should kill anyone slaying an elephant, unquote. This may be the earliest written record of protected areas and protected wildlife, and perhaps we could learn something from that. About 50 years later, about 250 BC, Emperor Ashoka, also of India, brought Buddhism to India, to the Indian Empire. He also stopped royal hunting, and he created a series of wildlife laws. Some of these laws or rules were inscribed on stone monuments, and they're called the Pillar Edicts. They required protection of some wild mammals, birds, and fish. These may be the earliest form of written game laws. Hunting preserves were another form of what we would now call biodiversity conservation. From very early times, rulers and others of wealth maintained reserves or preserves to conserve wildlife and fish for the exclusive use of their owners. Hunting preserves for royalty or the wealthy existed in virtually all countries in past millennia, and many of these have been converted recently to reserves or national parks. At least as far back as the 6th century AD in Europe, there was a systematic clearance of forests. This was called taming of the forest, and it went so far that it created a very significant backlash among European rulers, what was called an imperious need for forest protection. About 780 AD, Charlemagne established what are considered to be the first conservation policies and writings in Europe. They incorporate the antiphonal themes of forest clearance and forest protection. For example, his instructions detail how to kill wolves and how to clear land, but they also call for guarding forests to protect, primarily to protect the wild animals therein. And this interesting juxtaposition may indicate an early groping for a balance between the conservation of resources and forests and the other needs of humans. By the 11th century in Europe, there were well-established conservation laws throughout most countries. And in 1066, William of Normandy brought most of those to Great Britain. In Europe, the threat to wildlife, particularly large mammals, from hunting eventually led to policies of pure protection. as it had in India over 1,000 years earlier. Examples included King Jagiellon of Poland, who in 1423 promulgated a law protecting aurochs and wild horses, both of which incidentally later became extinct. The Swiss canton of Glarus prohibited hunting in the Karpstock Mountains and established a reserve which still exists. And Prince of Orange in Holland, Holland State in 1576, established the Wood of the Hague as a pure reserve. In the West, except for the species which were hunted perhaps, there was a predominant idea that changes in the environment were all the work of God, not the work of man. This belief was undoubtedly fostered by the very slow rate of environmental change, of human-caused environmental change. And it persisted into the 19th century when the American George Perkins Marsh published a book, The Earth as Modified by Human Action. And this firmly established that humans were the cause of the environmental degradation that was so well noted by that time. And of course, this provided an important direction for virtually all future conservation efforts. Throughout most of history, the rate of anthropogenic environmental change was very slow. And then, as the great geographer Carl Sauer wrote in 1938, quote, "In the late 18th century, the progressively and rapidly cumulative destructive effects of European exploitation became marked. In the space of a century and a half, only 2 full lifetimes, more damage has been done to the productive capacity of the world than all human history preceding." That was 1938, and things have gotten progressively worse since then. This process was particularly marked in North America. There, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the efforts of energetic European colonists pretty well destroyed vast amounts of resources. Great forests were cut and burned. Agricultural lands from coast to coast were abused, abandoned. The great herds of buffalo were pretty well destroyed. The inexhaustible flocks of passenger pigeon exterminated. In the later 1800s, people felt the impact of this destruction, and they recognized what was happening, and for the first time in history, there was a great movement to do something about it. Concerned citizens started non-governmental organizations, NGOs, focusing on particular environmental problems. And the federal government established agencies which were the forerunners of, for example, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. For the first time, concern for the environment, and particularly natural resources, including biodiversity conservation, became a high priority for a national government. Although by no means a steady progression, since that time in North America, there have been remarkable strides in biodiversity conservation, including involving scientists, universities, the government, NGOs, and so forth. This is recent history. Many of you know it, so I won't cover that here. Other parts of the world saw increasing recognition of environmental degradation focused primarily on rapidly disappearing larger forms of wildlife. And by the late 1800s, there were substantial conservation initiatives being undertaken in many areas. From the earliest times, the efforts that we now call conservation biology or environmental biodiversity conservation mostly focused on large mammals. This was logical because they represented sport and sources of meat and other animal products, or they represented a threat to people or people's interests, livestock and crops. The early exterminations record this situation. For example, from the time of Christ to 1800, the rate of exterminations, of recorded exterminations of large mammals, went from 1 each 55 years to 1 a year. 54% of these exterminations were large predators, members of the dog, cat, or bear family, and 40% were the large herbivores, including wild horses, cattle, bison, ibexes, deer, and elk. Hunters were among the first to observe the depletion and loss of these species and to seek to remedy the loss of their quarry. In the United States in the 1800s, a number of sport hunters had banded together in hunting clubs throughout most of the country. And these clubs became exceedingly worried about the loss of deer and other wildlife to unrestricted commercial hunting, market hunting. Many of them petitioned the state governments to do something about this, and the governments did indeed pass, many of them passed hunting laws and established game departments, but knowledgeable staff were hard to come by. So in the early days, many of the members of the hunting clubs were deputized by the state governments to serve as the staff of these new game departments to implement the laws. Internationally, colonial administrators and military officers, particularly serving in various nations' colonies around the world, became increasingly worried about the loss of their quarry. Recognizing the need for cooperation, a number of those, initially British, in 1903 established the Society for the Protection of the Fauna of the Empire. And this was widely known as the Society of Repentant Butchers because of the hunting background of the members. It was the world's first international conservation NGO, and it remains active today as Fauna and Flora International. Since the late 1800s, there have been increasing efforts to preserve biodiversity throughout much of the world. And these have generally followed a progression. The progression starts with focus on individual species, spreads to groups of species, ultimately to habitat, ultimately integrating conservation into development, and most recently, focusing on the benefits to people. Now, Africa provides a very good example of this progression. In the decades following South Africa's 1892 establishment of the Kruger Reserve, other reserves were established throughout much of Africa. These were established primarily to protect large mammals. In 1900, representatives of the colonial powers in Africa met and drafted a convention for the preservation of wild animals, birds, and fish in Africa, but it was never ratified. Again, this spoke to species alone, but it did expand from mammals to fish to birds. Then finally, in 1933, the colonial powers again sought to remedy the situation, and they succeeded in developing the African Convention relevant to the preservation of fauna and flora in their native state. This marked a significant broadening. The effort was moved from straight fauna to fauna and flora, from individual species to groups of species to habitats in general, and it called for the setting up of national parks and reserves. The next truly significant change came with the 1961 Conference on Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources in Modern African States, which was held in Arusha, Tanganyika, now Tanzania. This was a meeting of representatives of the African nations that were independent or were about to become independent. And it sought to place biodiversity conservation and conservation of natural resources in general within the context of development and to show the benefits of sustainable management of resources. In the same year, the Masai Mara Reserve was established in Kenya as, in effect, a tribal national park run by the local Africans with the cash and other benefits from the park, the reserve, accruing to them, the local Africans, not to the central government. And this was the first example of what became known as community conservation. Since that time, community conservation efforts have been undertaken throughout much of the world, some successful and some not so. It's significant that the Mara has remained Kenya's premier wildlife area. Then in 1968, the Organization of African Unity developed the Convention on Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources in Africa. And this was a formal diplomatic document establishing the principle that conservation was an essential part of development. And this principle, of course, became one of the foundations several years later of the historic 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm. So Africa has exemplified this progression of what we now call biodiversity conservation, from a focus on individual species of large mammals to groups of animals, to concern with flora as well as fauna, to habitats and significant areas. The stakeholder context has expanded from individual hunters to the communities living near the resources, to governments, and to intergovernmental bodies. The concern with narrow utilitarian or sport values of biodiversity has expanded to recognition of the multiple values of biological resources to human resource, human welfare, and development. And it also shows the shift from protection of biodiversity against people to conservation of biodiversity for people. It also, of course, exemplifies the growing recognition of the need to organize, connect, and bring in all the stakeholders, and it reflects a growing ecological sophistication. To a degree, A similar progression has occurred elsewhere throughout the world. But it should be emphasized that these developments usually involved only a very small number of people. And this was the case throughout the world until the late 1960s, when at least in the United States and Europe, there was unprecedented concern with the environment on the part of the general public. In effect, it sort of exploded. International agreements on the environment have played an increasingly important role in biodiversity conservation. Initially, they only involved species that migrated across from one country to another. But increased globalization and increased recognition of the interconnections between nations, the ecological interconnections, have led to a series of much broader agreements, including the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1993. The national biodiversity action plans or strategies that are required by that convention have made real progress in integrating biodiversity conservation programs in a number of countries. There have, of course, been dramatic improvements in environmental science in recent decades. First, of course, there are new developments in technology, which have provided tools unheard of by earlier biologists. Understanding of ecosystem dynamics has been dramatically improved. The International Biological Program, their biome studies, which were preceded by pioneering East African ecosystem studies, showed how cooperative, interdisciplinary research could provide the information that leads to understanding complex ecosystems and also the information needed for conservation. One result of all this has been a profound change in how ecosystems are perceived. Formerly, the dominant paradigm was that of an ecosystem that was stable, closed, internally regulated, and which behaved in a deterministic manner. This paradigm was the foundation on which management of natural resources, particularly living resources such as fisheries, game, forests, and rangelands, were based. But it was also used as a base for conservation and for endangered species conservation. Now it's recognized that an ecosystem is a much more open system, one which is in a constant state of flux, not stable. It's without long-term stability, and it's affected by a whole series of human and other impacts, many of them stochastic, from outside the system. And as a result, an ecosystem is characterized by uncertainty rather than the opposite. This new understanding of ecosystem dynamics is leading to profound changes in conservation and management of living resources. It's now realized, of course, that management of a protected area must take the ecosystem into account. Simply putting a fence around an area and expecting it to maintain its identity won't work. Similar considerations apply to species conservation and to harvest of living resources. Most scientists and some managers now realize that the impacts on the ecosystem caused by logging, hunting, fishing, and so forth may lead to irreversible changes in the ecosystem. Further, and perhaps even more important, it's now recognized that social and economic factors often lead to impacts on ecosystems, as well as play a fundamental role in determining what are the management goals and actions, and that they too must be taken into account in virtually any conservation situation. In other words, we are learning it's not enough to deal with the biological resources per se, we have to deal with the economic and political and social milieu. Of course, in the belief that the traditional scientific disciplines were not using this new knowledge effectively to deal with the scientific complexity and the urgency of conservation, the Society of Conservation Biology was established, and as you know, it's developed conservation biology into a vigorous new discipline. Well, we've seen that conservation biology's deep roots extend back over 2 millennia. They've led to an increasing understanding of biodiversity and ways to try to conserve it. Much of our progress has come in relatively recent times, and much of our modern history, of course, is in the last couple of centuries. It's only really in recent years that our current understanding of ecosystem dynamics and consequently conservation and management have developed. Yet, these two relatively stable and comfortable, climatically comfortable centuries have been an anomaly in terms of global climate. Now we're faced with a global climate change at unprecedented rates. And because of these rates, we do not have past history or experience on which to build present or future management very effectively. Increasingly, scientists are calling the present period the Anthropocene. The previous periods, for example, the Pleistocene, which ended about 11,700 years ago, and the Holocene, which followed it, were determined by geological and other natural factors, forces. But now human activities have changed so much of the face of the earth and the climate that it's human actions that create and dominate the Anthropocene. It's a whole new dimension. We know that global warming has already altered the environment and global weather. Some species are already changing their ranges. Many will not be able to do so. They'll either have to adapt or go extinct. There won't be an orderly movement of ecosystems or species to cooler areas, either up the mountains or north. Consequently, there will certainly be novel combinations of species, novel ecosystems. The rate of change is such in the Anthropocene that the evolution, adaptation, and speciation that operated in the past simply won't have time to operate now. Well, what then is today's conservation biologist to do? One school of thought says change is inevitable. There will be benign exchange of new species and ecosystems for the previous ones. There'll be biological winners and losers, and we shouldn't waste effort trying to maintain part of past ecosystems and species assemblages in the face of inevitable failure. Well, that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is the belief that instead of a benign exchange, there will be an accelerating loss of species, resulting in loss of stability, loss of diversity. And consequently, our emphasis should be on mitigation along with ways to slow, stop, or delay the climate change. And of course, there's a whole range of points of view between these extremes. Regardless of which option we choose, it will profoundly affect what we do as conservation biologists. And it will be largely very different from what we've done in the past. Whatever the conservation biologist does, the options will be strongly affected by the need to provide for the increasing human population and its demands and impacts. Public policy, the impact of politics and economics, are and will be the determinants of biodiversity conservation. Further, the Anthropocene does not stop at one nation's borders. Conservation action must be international, indeed global, but it requires governance of a much higher order than we are seeing today nationally and internationally. It also requires more emphasis on research, especially to track and anticipate the changes that the Anthropocene is bringing. And especially, and I emphasize especially, it also requires conservation biologists to take a more active part in making and implementing policy. So the message that I hope you take to this Congress and beyond is that conservation biology has come a long way, has accomplished a great deal, but never has it had as great and difficult a set of challenges as it faces today and tomorrow. Those challenges will dwarf the challenges we've met in the past. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. If you can stay on the podium, please, Lee. Thanks. Questions? Okay, thank you very much, Lee.
It's wonderful.
Yeah,
I've covered everything, and therefore there's no questions left.
Okay, if you've got a question, please go up to the microphone.
Is the microphone working? Yeah. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we have what's called well, there are triggers in terms of air quality. When the air quality is bad, then there's something that takes place to try to mitigate that. What kind of triggers could we use for global warming? That, let's say, trigger people to stop driving their cars or something like that.
You mean what kind of triggers for people to recognize warming?
Yes, something that would, we could say, when this happens, we should do something about it immediately to get more people involved.
Well, I think there's a series of different kinds of triggers. One of them is being used fairly effectively in some ways, and that's the increasing loss of glaciers and ice caps and Arctic and Antarctic ice. Others are obvious changes in the fauna and to some degree the flora. For example, in California, in the Sierras, the pikas are reportedly getting much scarcer in many areas and having to move farther up the mountains. Before too long, there won't be any farther up for them to go. One of the triggers that's often used is simply average temperatures, averaged in any one of a number of ways, average daily, average seasonal, things of that sort. We're seeing increasingly that kind of an approach in, say, the Washington Post, in the political metropolis to the south of us here. There's also changes already in some of the fish fauna, and therefore the catch of the people, the fisher people in the bay and in the estuary of the San Joaquin, Sacramento, San Joaquin. There's a whole, in other words, there's a whole range, warming, global warming is, it's a complex, the impact is complex, and it's also not a kind of a direct line. That is, certain areas are going to get warmer and drier, as many areas in the Southwest, because of the warming, the lowered or earlier springtime, lower winter snowpack, there's less water, the summers are drier, therefore the wildfires are more severe and cover more area. That's another trigger that is being used to some degree, being written about certainly. I don't know whether that helps. There's not a really simple answer, however.
Hey, Lee, this is Gary Tabor here. You're an institutional guy. I mean, you've worked for the World Bank, you work with many governments, government institutions, NGOs. You mentioned governance in the future. What's your vision or thinking about what would be the institutions that might try to achieve this global conservation focus as we enter the next 100 years?
We have the United Nations. Some people have said, well, we should try to get something new, but it's usually much more effective to try to improve what we've got than to start over from scratch, particularly when one looks at the whole history of the attempts to create a United Nations. We need to have a much more effective environmental unit, in my view, within the United Nations, where it would be considerably higher in the hierarchy and have a good deal more power than the present United Nations Environment Program. It has done a great deal that is very beneficial, but because of the structure of the UN, it's fairly limited in what it can accomplish. We really need more than that.
During my lifetime, the population of the Earth has tripled. This cannot go on at the current rate much longer, and one of the greatest things we could do for conservation would be to make family planning assistance available to all of those who would like to use it.
Well, certainly in my view, there's no question but that population is a major factor and a major driver of much of the environmental degradation, in large part because family planning is not available in many places where rapidly increasing population means rapidly increasing poverty. There's not a simple relationship of number of people to environmental impact or even use of resources. So I certainly agree with you.
I think you are absolutely right that we need to be totally conceptualizing the problem in new ways, but that is a gradual process as well. We're all learning how to do that. Have you become excited about any examples of new problem solving that you see emerging?
I guess the answer has to be maybe a kind of a generic no.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
There are a great many individuals and some organizations that are trying very hard to get out of some of the old molds and to do things that are really effective. The difficulty, in perhaps large part, is that many of them are operating individually, and they haven't coalesced into sort of movements and that sort of a thing. For example, in the 60s, a combination of TV, modern media, and the writing and speaking of people like Rachel Carson led to a tremendous upwelling of public concern about environment in a way that was absolutely new. In my view, a great deal of the reason for that was the media, which brought environmental problems like, excuse me, like the Torrey Canyon, or Santa Barbara oil spills, or the Cuyahoga River bursting into flames, things like that, which in the previously would have been localized environmental disasters, but they were made, the public was made aware in a very big way of these things, and it led to a very major movement. This has not, this has not unhappily occurred since that time. I think much of what we saw in that period, our government and then other governments and then the United Nations responded to this outpouring of public concern and changed a great deal of what was happening. Since that time, and since the 70s, which were really a period, kind of a golden age of conservation, the advances that have been made have been very minimal, relatively. We need to have, perhaps, among other things, a more enlightened kind of a media that would, or a more enlightened conservation biologists who could get to the media to make sure that these messages get across in ways other than just sort of fairly banal, usual stories.
Thank you so much for the part that you played in that era.
I
Thank
beg
you.
pardon?
Thank you so much for the part that you played in helping to craft that first wave of legislation.
My name is Melinda Agapita from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Your speech kind of looked into that, development or improving our knowledge as far as conservation is concerned. So I think the more we know things, the more we actually realize the challenges and limitations ahead of us in doing conservation. So I think the question here is, what do you think conservation, in terms perhaps of strategy or other things that you think might be more relevant to discuss, should be heading for? I know you've kind of mentioned about global governance, but you said it's not enough, like for example, the UN. Is there any other thing that you can think about as to what should be heading for, what should we be heading for amidst of these challenges and limitations that we're facing today?
I'm not sure I'm not sure I really follow you.
Okay.
What should we be heading for?
Yeah, I think in terms of strategies, because I think my point is, the more we get to know, the more our information, our knowledge is growing, the more that we know the challenges and limitations ahead of us in doing conservation. So I think the question there is, what do you think conservation research or practice should be heading for amidst of these challenges and limitations? Probably in terms of strategies, if you could think of in that line of... I know you've mentioned about global governance in passing. That could be one of those, and I'm not sure if you want to touch on a little bit more about that.
Well, in terms, you've mentioned several things, I believe. In terms of science and where we should be heading, I think one of the things we need, as I mentioned rather briefly, was to learn considerably more about where we're going, about what tracking the changes we're coming to and getting in this Anthropocene period, anticipating, enabling us to anticipate how to deal with that from a conservation biology point of view. It's a question of how do we deal with novel ecosystems and maybe even novel species. I indicated that there are these rather wildly differing points of view from of what's going to happen in the Anthropocene, from the somewhat utopian idea that we'll sit back and enjoy it, we're going to lose a lot of species, but what's coming is going to be beneficial or productive, to what I regard as a very much more rational, objective assessment that unless we can do something pretty effective, we're going to lose a great deal of the species we've got and the ecosystems, the stability such as it is. And that, of course, has real impacts to people in terms of environmental services and all of that, which will be changed pretty dramatically. In terms of conservation focus, I think my major message on this really is that we are already in this Anthropocene situation. Conditions are changing so rapidly that we cannot simply continue to do what we've been doing all along. The things we've learned the past decades or centuries, many of them were fine for that period. But we're entering a very new period, and this is true whether we're talking about the problems with loss of amphibians, problems of management of forest resources, of fishery resources, or concern with endangered species in general. And I don't see very much overt recognition of the fact that the game has changed and is going to change a very great deal more. And I think that's one of the things that, one of the goals that I think we should be moving toward, the recognition that the playing field has changed, and we have to deal with the new playing field if we're going to be effective at all.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Tanya. Thank you for your talk today. I'm just curious about the different strategies that conservation biologists can potentially use to engage federal agencies to change the policies that's sort of apart from litigation. Is there some other way that they can voice their opinion and make a policy change?
I'm afraid my ears are not too good and I didn't really follow you.
That's fine. I'll repeat it. I've noticed that many NGOs have used a practice of litigation, suing an agency to make their voices heard, a federal agency such as EPA, for example, and to make it known that they wish a change to be made. I'm just curious, are there other alternatives that they can use to make policy changes and make their voice heard so that they can
You mean
make a change?
Alternatives to NGOs?
No, if NGOs themselves can use a strategy other than litigation to make effective policy changes.
Well, some of the NGOs have very effective, in effect, lobbying arms with Congress and with some of the states. The things which, to get changes, we have, certainly in federal government and in most of the state governments, we have to have an enlightened Congress or enlightened governance, whichever it is. Part of this requires public letting them know, the elected representatives know what we want, what is needed. NGOs have been, many of them, some of them have been very effective with this. Another part is making sure that we have enough, that they have enough information to go on, so that what they're recommending is based on good science. But another approach, Congress and there's the government here, but then there's also industry. And certainly in terms of global warming, a number of our larger industries have been much more realistic about that than the government has. And so I think that as some of the NGOs have been doing, trying to work with or enlighten the leadership of some of these major industries is another route that NGOs could exploit more effectively. Now, there is a problem in that some in the NGO community say, well, any NGO that gets in bed with industry is a sellout. This can happen, but in my view, unless industry can be brought along and also perhaps can lead, and I see that happening in Europe as well as here, unless that can happen, we're not going to move very fast, very far. Does that get at what you...
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, you played a big role in the early 1970s, as you referred to, in creating some pretty landmark legislation, the Endangered Species Act, for example, a remarkable act to read still today because it frankly contains so much biology. It refers so explicitly to science. The other pieces of legislation during that era equally so. What was the trick? What were you guys doing at that time that allowed both the Congress and a sitting president to grasp and sign off on such remarkably science-based legislation? And what trick can we use today?
I wish I knew. Part of the trick was that was historical. I mentioned the 60s when there was the great raising of public concern, awareness of environmental issues. And the public contacted, if you just take the U.S., the public wrote to Congress in absolutely unprecedented numbers about doing something about this. Most of the people in Congress at that time had very little idea what environment was. Now there were a few, an outstanding few, who had already been worried about environment and they didn't have scientific backgrounds, but they were very concerned. But the great majority didn't know what it was all about. They were sort of caught flat-footed. And so Congress established a joint congressional, joint Senate-House Committee on the Environment that I was an advisor to. This was in the late 60s. Several of the members of Congress and senators told me that what they really wanted this committee to do was to tell them what is this environment thing that everybody's excited about. So you're starting with, to some degree, with a blank slate without political baggage other than the fact that there's a lot of public concern with it. Second point that's critically important, at that time, Congress, both the Senate and the House, were in effect in a cooperative sort of a mode. It was possible to get bipartisan support for things. And the fact that this advisory committee was a joint Senate-House committee also speaks to this. So when we got the National Environmental Policy Act up for a final vote in late 1969, it was virtually unanimous. The vote for the Endangered Species Act was virtually unanimous. There may have been 4 abstentions or something. The vote for virtually all of the environmental legislation that we put together early in the 70s was, if not totally bipartisan, it was so bipartisan that there was no question of it not passing. Then, particularly starting in 1980, there was the administration and Congress became bitterly partisan, and the question of environment became politicized to the point where if one side promoted something, the other side would simply react negatively. And that's what we're seeing today, not just in environment, but in a great many other things. So the situation has gotten worse and worse. And those of us that were directly involved in late 60s and early 70s had the great good fortune to come at a period when history was right, when the situation was right for getting something like that done. The other big thing was, at that time, that the Council on Environmental Quality was created under the National Environmental Policy Act. It's the President's Council, so it's in the executive office. The leadership of that, the first chair was the Honorable Russell Train, was exceedingly knowledgeable about environmental issues and how to get things done in Washington, and he assembled a quite extraordinary group of staff who had broad experience with these things, and it was possible with this critical mass of basically young, driven people who were pretty capable to get, and that interacting with a willing Congress and a public that was still very concerned with environment, it was possible to get an awful lot done. We have hardly any of those conditions today. So I'm not sure how we get from here to there today.
Lee, I have a final question for you. At this meeting, we've got one of the highest proportions of graduate students we've ever seen at a SCB meeting. As a godfather of conservation, what would you advise to these early career conservationists? And as a second part, what would you advise to our new SCB executive directors and presidents as to the way SCB should be going?
Ooh. Well, for grad students, my first advice is follow your dream. If you want to go into conservation or environment, any aspect of environment, do so. And don't be dissuaded. There are going to be an awful lot of people who say, well, there's no money in it, there's no future in it. Of course, there's no future for any of us if we're not effective in conservation. Then it's really important to learn how the system works. We can cuss at Congress, the system is broke, sort of a thing, but in truth, we've got to live with that, with it, and we've got to be able to operate within it. If we're going to improve it, we've got to know how it works. So you want to learn all you can about how the system works politically, how the executive branch works, how the different agencies work, the ones that are of particular interest to you. Then it's, in my view, it's exceedingly important to combine science with policy. That is, learn, if you're on the scientific side, and I would imagine many of the grad students here are, if you have a real burning desire properly to do something about conservation, you're not going to do it by being a narrow scientist who does nothing but say, this is academic, I'm going to be academic, I'm going to do my research and put out my papers, and the world will read my papers and things will happen. It isn't going to happen that way. You need, as I said, to know how the system works. Therefore, you've got to learn how does policy get set? How do you influence policy? And you don't influence policy by doing scientific papers. As Chris indicated, I've done an awful lot of scientific papers, but those, for the most part, have had virtually zero impact on policy. Whereas the work I've been able to do with governments, with policy, with the real world of trying to, how do you change things, based on the science, that's where you get things done. So I guess my advice is, first decide what is your goal? What does your heart say you want to do? And if it is to achieve conservation, then you need to learn how conservation is achieved, and you've got to do a good deal more than being a good scientist. If, on the other hand, you wish to stay in a purely academic kind of a situation and stay out of the rough and tumble of the real world, but contribute to scientific knowledge, ultimately that knowledge will make a difference. It will be important. And by all means do that. That's valuable too. But that's not going to achieve conservation, in my view, conservation in the short run. And I guess, following up your second question, Chris, I think what the SCB could do, it seems to me it was created to be effective and be active in conservation, not just to add to scientific knowledge. And therefore an emphasis on that and a rewarding of people who get involved with that sort of a thing is important. There are all sorts of counter-influences in a traditional academic situation. You'll be told that it's not scientific or not proper, or there's no future in being applied, in quotes, as opposed to pure, in quotes. Well, in truth, there's no applied or pure. It's a range. But the SCB is really very close to an applied organization, it seems to me. It was created that way, and anything it can do to help to improve the status, the understanding of that aspect of the need to really get out and do conservation will pay off in a very big way. That answer your question?
I think your wife has a question. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Just to remind moderators, be at your session 10 minutes before the session starts. Remember to upload your presentations the day before your presentation's due, please. And please visit the SCB booth downstairs. For the Marine Oceania Section Social, there's directions on how to get there. There are SCB goodies for sale, and there's also the SCB chapters auction items, and most importantly, how to join SCB.